My name is Natalie Brooks. If that stranger hadn't taken the seat beside me on a flight to Atlanta, I probably would have lived the rest of my life without ever knowing the truth. But sometimes, secrets buried for decades begin with nothing more than a glance. Natalie Brooks, 34 years old, had always believed she lived an ordinary life. She ran a small consulting company in Seattle. Her career was stable. Her life was stable. Her family seemed stable too. At least, that was what she believed. The trip that day was nothing more than a 2-day business conference. It was the kind of event she had attended countless times before, filled with familiar presentations and routine meetings with clients. There was absolutely nothing to suggest that her life was about to change forever. The woman sitting beside her looked to be in her early 60s. Her silver hair was neatly tied back. She was dressed simply and politely, and barely spoke during takeoff. But Natalie quickly noticed something. The woman kept looking at her, not with casual curiosity, not like someone who thought she recognized a familiar face. It was the look of someone who had just discovered something they could hardly believe. Natalie tried to ignore it. She opened her laptop, answered emails, reviewed her presentation, yet every few minutes, she could feel those eyes on her again. The first time she truly paid attention was when the silver bracelet on her wrist slipped out from beneath her sleeve. She had worn it since childhood. Her mother always told her it was her very first keepsake. Just a simple baby bracelet, nothing special. Yet the moment the woman saw it, she froze. She stopped reading, stopped moving. Her eyes locked onto the bracelet. Natalie glanced toward her. The woman immediately turned toward the window. But it was already too late. Natalie had seen the shock on her face. For the rest of the flight, the uneasy feeling continued to grow. Natalie was not someone who worried easily, but there was something about this woman that made it impossible to focus. About an hour before landing, the woman finally spoke. "Are you traveling to Atlanta for work?" Natalie nodded politely. "Yes." The woman smiled, then asked another question. "Were you born in Washington?" Natalie looked slightly surprised. "No. I grew up in Oregon for a while before moving to Seattle." The woman lowered her gaze. A strange expression crossed her face. It looked like disappointment, like someone who had hoped to find something and suddenly realized they hadn't. The conversation ended there, but the discomfort did not. As the plane began its descent, flight attendants performed their final checks. Passengers put away their laptops. Seatbacks were raised. Outside the window, the clouds slowly parted, revealing the city below. Natalie thought whatever had been bothering the woman was finally over. She was wrong. The woman turned completely toward her. For the first time during the entire flight, she looked directly into Natalie's eyes. Her hands trembled slightly. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry. This may sound like a very strange question." Natalie immediately tensed. The woman took a deep breath, then asked, "Is your mother Eleanor Brooks?" Natalie's heart skipped a beat, not because of the question itself, but because of the way it was asked, as if both of their lives somehow depended on the answer. Natalie slowly nodded. "Yes." Then she frowned. "How do you know my mother's name?" The color drained from the woman's face. Her eyes instantly filled with tears. For several seconds, she couldn't speak. Finally, she reached into the handbag beneath her seat. She pulled out an old envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a photograph. Natalie took it. The picture had clearly been taken many years ago. A newborn baby lay in a hospital bassinet. Beside the crib stood a young woman crying. Natalie had never seen that woman before. But what sent a chill through her entire body was hidden in the corner of the photograph. The baby in the picture was wearing the exact same silver bracelet Natalie wore on her wrist at that very moment. Every detail matched perfectly. Natalie looked up. The woman was watching her. Tears glistened in the corners of her eyes. For the first time, she introduced herself. "My name is Claire Morgan." Natalie's throat suddenly felt dry. "Who are you?" Claire clenched her hands tightly together, as if she had waited years for this moment. Then she answered slowly, "I think I've been searching for you for more than 30 years. The air between them seemed to freeze. The engines continued humming. Passengers around them prepared to leave their seats. But for Natalie, the world had suddenly stopped moving. Then Claire said the words that began to crack apart everything Natalie believed about her life. My sister lost her daughter at St. Helena Hospital the summer you were born. She paused, then added quietly, the very same week, your mother suddenly became a mother. The plane touched down on the runway, but Natalie barely felt the impact, because for the first time in her life, she found herself asking a terrifying question. If Claire was telling the truth, then who was the woman she had called mom for more than 30 years? Natalie could barely remember how she got off the plane. The entire walk from the gate to baggage claim, only one sentence echoed through her mind. I think I've been searching for you for more than 30 years. Claire Morgan never pressured her. She never tried to convince her. She never made any absolute claims. That was what made everything so frightening. Because people who lie usually work hard to prove they are right. Claire simply shared the burden she had carried for decades. The two women found a quiet corner inside the airport. Outside the glass windows, planes continued taking off and landing. Inside, time seemed to slow down. Claire pulled out another collection of old documents, faded envelopes, carefully folded letters, hospital records yellowed by age. Natalie stared at the pile spread across the table. A strange feeling settled inside her. It felt as though she was touching the life of a complete stranger, yet somehow that life seemed connected to her own. Claire took a deep breath. Then she began talking about her sister. Her name was Abigail Morgan. Natalie listened quietly. 32 years earlier, Abigail had given birth to her first daughter at St. Helena Hospital on the outskirts of Portland. The delivery had been complicated. Abigail spent most of the process heavily sedated. When she woke up, the doctors told her that her baby had not survived. Everything happened quickly. Too quickly. There was no chance to see her daughter one last time. No funeral. No death certificate placed in her hands. Only a brief explanation and sympathetic nods from hospital staff. Claire lowered her eyes toward the table. Her voice grew softer, but Abigail never believed them. Natalie looked up immediately. Claire continued. For years, Abigail insisted she had heard a newborn crying after doctors told her the baby was gone. Nobody believed her. Not her family. Not even her husband. Everyone assumed it was the reaction of a grieving mother. But Abigail never changed her story. Not once. For 30 years, the story remained exactly the same. A chill ran across Natalie's skin. Claire opened one of the letters, then handed it to her. Soft handwriting filled the aging page. Every line revolved around a single question. Where did my daughter go? Natalie read another letter. Then another. They were all the same. Abigail wrote to the hospital, to attorneys, to health authorities. But none of the letters ever received a clear answer. At that moment, Natalie decided to call her mother. The phone rang only once. Eleanor Brooks answered almost immediately. Her voice sounded familiar, comforting, normal, but only for a few seconds. Mom, do you know someone named Claire Morgan? Silence. A long, unnatural silence. Natalie had never heard her mother become so quiet before. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Where are you? Natalie froze. That was not an answer. It was not a denial either. It sounded like the reaction of someone who had just heard the thing they feared most. Natalie briefly explained what had happened on the plane. The other end of the line remained silent. Then Eleanor spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. Some things are better left alone. The call ended immediately afterward. Natalie called back. No answer. She tried again. Still nothing. The third call went straight to voicemail. A cold sensation traveled down her spine. Her mother had never done that before. Never. That evening, a text message arrived from her father. Only one sentence. Do not meet with that woman again. Natalie stared at the screen for a long time. Then she replied, Why? The response came almost immediately. Because she wants something from you. Natalie read the message again and again. It made no sense. If Claire wanted money, property, some kind of benefit, why would she spend more than 3 decades searching? Everything was becoming more absurd with every passing hour. The following morning, Claire called. There was something different in her voice. Natalie, I found someone. Natalie's heart immediately began racing. Someone who had worked at St. Helena Hospital during that time. 2 days later, they met Walter Hayes, a man in his 70s, a former hospital administrator. He lived alone in a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Walter greeted them cautiously. Then he saw Natalie, and froze. For several seconds. Nobody spoke. Walter stared at her for a long moment. His expression was not one of surprise. It was recognition, as though he had suddenly come face to face with a memory from long ago. Finally, he lowered his glasses, let out a slow breath, and spoke. "I thought I would take this secret to my grave." Natalie's heart immediately started pounding. Walter explained that many hospital records had disappeared during a transfer of ownership years earlier. Hundreds of files had been lost. But one particular file had haunted him ever since. A newborn's file. Walter looked directly at Natalie. His voice dropped. The same week Abigail Morgan gave birth, another woman also delivered a baby girl. He paused. That woman's name was Eleanor Brooks. The room seemed to freeze. Natalie felt her hands turn cold. But what Walter said next was even worse. He opened an old notebook, turned to a faded page, pointed to a handwritten note, then spoke slowly. The two newborn files were assigned consecutive numbers. He paused again. But one of those numbers disappeared completely. No reason. No explanation. No trace. Walter looked up at Natalie. His eyes carried decades of regret. Then he said the words that left her completely frozen. "You have Abigail Morgan's eyes." And for the first time in her life, Natalie became terrified that the woman she called Mom might be hiding a truth far bigger than anything she had ever imagined. After meeting Walter Hayes, Natalie did not return to her hotel right away. She drove aimlessly for hours. The road stretched endlessly ahead. Rows of trees drifted past her window. But her mind remained trapped on a single sentence. "You have Abigail Morgan's eyes." It was not proof, but it was no longer a coincidence either. In less than a week, too many impossible things had happened. A stranger had recognized the silver bracelet on her wrist. A mother had spent decades searching for her daughter. Hospital records had disappeared. Phone calls had been cut short. And fear had been unmistakable in her mother's voice. Natalie knew she had to return to Seattle, not to search for answers from strangers, but to find answers inside the very home where she had grown up. 2 days later, she stood in front of her parents' house. Everything looked exactly the same. The front garden, the wooden chair on the porch, the familiar windows. From the outside, it was the picture of an ordinary family home. But Natalie had begun to suspect that behind those walls was a completely different story. She did not go inside immediately. Instead, she headed straight toward the storage room behind the garage, the place where her mother had kept things for years. Natalie had helped clean it countless times before, but she had never really paid attention. Today was different. She opened one box after another. Cardboard containers, dust-covered cabinets, forgotten shelves. Time moved slowly. 1 hour, then 2, then 3, until she noticed an old wooden box hidden deep in the farthest corner. A thick layer of dust covered the lid, as if nobody had touched it in years. Natalie opened it. Inside was an ivory-colored baby blanket, carefully folded. She picked it up. Immediately, something felt wrong. In one corner of the blanket were 2 embroidered initials. A.M. Natalie froze. Abigail Morgan. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. The blanket did not belong to the Brooks family. It belonged to the woman her mother had always claimed she never knew. But that was only the beginning. Beneath the blanket was a stack of envelopes tied together with an old ribbon. Natalie opened the first one. Elegant handwriting appeared across the page, addressed to Eleanor Brooks. Her hands began to shake. She opened another. Again, Eleanor Brooks. A third. A fourth. A fifth. Every single letter had been sent to her mother, and every single one carried the same signature. Abigail Morgan. Natalie slowly sat down on the floor. Her heart raced. She began reading. Each letter felt like another blade cutting deeper into the truth. Abigail never threatened anyone. She never sounded angry. She never asked for money. She asked only one thing. Is my daughter healthy? Is she loved? Please tell me she is alive. That was all. Yet not one letter had ever been answered. Natalie continued searching. This time, she discovered a folder hidden among old tax documents. Inside were hospital invoices, payment receipts, large transfers of money made during the exact period when she had been born. There was no longer any doubt. Her parents knew far more than they had admitted. That evening, Natalie confronted her father. Robert Brooks sat silently for a very long time. He did not deny anything. He did not become angry. He did not try to avoid the conversation. That frightened Natalie more than anything else. Finally, he lowered his head. His shoulders seemed heavier than she had ever seen them, as if he had aged years in a single moment. Then he spoke. "I thought everything was legal." Natalie felt the air leave the room. Robert continued. "Back then, your mother and I were desperate for a child. Desperate. A middleman approached us. He said he could help. Quickly. Quietly. Without years of waiting like traditional adoption programs. We agreed. We paid a large amount of money. And then we were given a baby girl. Natalie." Silence filled the room. Robert stared at his hands. His voice was exhausted. But a few years later, things began to change. The letters started arriving. Then more letters. And more. That was when your mother realized something wasn't right. Natalie stared at him. The feeling of betrayal rose painfully inside her chest. If she knew, why didn't she tell the truth? Robert closed his eyes. "Because we were afraid of losing you." The answer left Natalie speechless. But the most painful revelation was still to come. Robert hesitated for a long time. Then he shared something he had never told anyone. One afternoon, many years earlier, a woman had come to their front door. It was Abigail Morgan. She did not scream. She did not cause a scene. She did not demand her daughter back. She only wanted to see Natalie. Just once. Natalie's throat tightened. She imagined a mother standing outside that very house, only a few feet away from her child, yet unable to step inside. Robert lowered his head. "Your mother never opened the door." The words hit like a hammer. Everything Natalie had believed shattered at once. The next morning, she went to see Eleanor Brooks, the woman who had raised her, the woman she once believed would never lie to her. Eleanor opened the door. The moment she saw the letters in Natalie's hands, the color drained from her face. Neither of them spoke. The silence felt suffocating. Natalie placed the letters on the table, then laid the baby blanket beside them. Finally, she looked directly into her mother's eyes. For the first time in her life, she no longer knew whether she was looking at a mother or a keeper of secrets. Tears began rolling down Eleanor's face. Her body trembled as she sat down. There was nowhere left to hide. No explanation powerful enough to bury the truth. At last, Eleanor broke down and spoke the words Natalie had both feared and desperately needed to hear. "I knew." Just 2 words, but they were enough to shatter 32 years of lies, and enough to change Natalie's life forever. The room remained silent for a long time after Eleanor Brooks spoke those 2 words. "I knew." Natalie sat across from the woman who had raised her entire life. Eleanor was crying. Not the kind of tears that begged for forgiveness, but the tears of someone who had carried a burden for far too long. Outside the window, the sun slowly sank below the horizon. The light inside the room gradually faded. Yet neither woman got up to turn on a lamp. Both understood that some darkness cannot be driven away by light. Eleanor wiped her eyes. Her trembling hands clasped together. When she spoke again, her voice was rough and strained. "At first, I didn't know." Natalie listened in silence. It was the only thing she could do. Eleanor explained that when Natalie first came home, she genuinely believed everything was legal. The paperwork had been prepared. Promises had been made. The intermediary assured her that every procedure had been completed. And more than anything, Eleanor wanted to believe it, because she had waited so long for a child. Years of disappointment. Years of hope followed by heartbreak. When Natalie entered her life, she held on to that chance with everything she had. But then the first letters arrived. 1 letter, then 2, then more. Eleanor slowly began to realize a terrible truth. Somewhere out there was a woman desperately searching for her daughter, and the child Eleanor called her own might be that little girl. Natalie looked at her mother. "Then why didn't you tell the truth?" Eleanor closed her eyes. "Because I was afraid." The answer was painfully simple. Not greed. Not money. Not property. Fear. Fear of losing the daughter she loved every single day. Fear that the truth would take Natalie away from her. And because of that fear, she chose silence. Year after year, decade after decade, until silence became a part of her life. Natalie felt tears burning at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to blame someone. She wanted to scream. But when she looked at the woman sitting before her, she did not see a monster. She did not see a villain. She saw a flawed human being, a mother who had made a terrible choice. A choice that lasted more than 30 years. 3 weeks later, Natalie and Claire completed a DNA test together. The waiting period felt longer than any time in her life. Every morning when she woke up, she asked herself the same questions. What if Claire was right? What if her entire life had been built upon a secret? The results finally arrived. Natalie sat alone in her apartment. Rain tapped softly against the windows. The glow of her computer screen filled the room. She opened the file. Her heart pounded. Words appeared on the screen. Natalie read them again and again, but the result never changed. Claire Morgan was a biological relative. The biological relationship had been confirmed. Natalie closed her eyes. Tears slipped silently down her face. In that moment, every doubt disappeared. Abigail Morgan was her biological mother. A few days later, Claire came to visit Natalie. This time she brought an old notebook. The cover was worn with age. Claire placed it gently on the table. This is the last thing my sister left behind. Natalie opened it. The pages were filled with Abigail's thoughts, journal entries written over many years. Some days were filled with despair. Some were filled with hope. Some sounded as if she was ready to give up. But not once did she stop searching. Natalie turned to the final pages. A short passage appeared in shaky handwriting. Perhaps it had been written near the end of Abigail's life. She read each word slowly. If my daughter is alive, please tell her that I have loved her every day since I lost her. Natalie could not continue. She lowered her head and cried harder than she ever had before. Not because of pain, but because she finally knew the truth. Her biological mother had never abandoned her, never forgotten her, never stopped searching for her. 1 month later, Natalie visited the cemetery where Abigail rested. The sky was clear. A gentle breeze moved through the trees. She carried a bouquet of white flowers, the old photograph Claire had protected for decades, and the answer Abigail had waited her entire life to hear. Natalie sat beside the grave, quietly telling the story of her life, about school, about work, about the dreams she had achieved, about all the things a mother should have been able to hear. Tears fell once more, but this time they were not tears of pain. They were tears of peace, because at last, 2 missing pieces had found each other. Many people later asked Natalie whether she forgave Eleanor. The answer was not simple, because life is rarely divided into right and wrong. Eleanor had lied, but she was also the woman who stayed awake all night when Natalie was sick, the woman who spent hours helping with homework, the woman who held her when her heart was broken for the first time. Those things were real, just as Abigail's love was real. Natalie did not want to erase one woman in order to honor the other. She chose to keep both of them in her heart. One woman had given her life. The other had raised her. And for the first time in her life, the story belonged to Natalie. Not to secrets, not to lies, not to fear. If you discovered that your family had hidden a life-changing truth from you for decades, would you choose forgiveness or would you walk away forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy emotional family stories like this one, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you can join us for the next story.